It began with a photograph. A small, sun-faded print found in the bottom drawer of an abandoned farmhouse outside Coleman County, Alabama. The kind of photograph you don't expect to see anymore, a family of 6, staring directly into the camera. No smiles. No warmth. Just a long wooden bed behind them, filling the frame like a quiet accusation. The note on the back read only one thing: all of us slept here. 1940. For years, no one could explain it. The farmhouse had been empty since the early 50s, left to rot under the pines. Locals said the family just vanished, left in the middle of the night, no goodbye, no sale, nothing. But what they left behind was worse than any ghost story. Because when investigators finally went through that house decades later, they realized it wasn't just a bed. It was the center of something older, something passed down through blood, through silence, through the kind of shame that shapes generations without a word ever being spoken. If you trace the land deeds back far enough, the story starts before Alabama was even a state. Back when the soil itself was worth more than the people living on it. The first records show a man named Silas Hargrove, a sharecropper, a widower, a man who signed his name with an X. Silas had one child, a daughter named Ruth. And in the census of 1880, the box beside relationship to head of household is left blank. No one wrote daughter. No one wrote wife. Just empty space. By the time the next census came, there were 3 children with the last name Hargrove, all listed under Ruth. The father's name was marked as unknown. But in towns like that, everyone already knew. They just didn't say it. People whispered about the Hargrove bed, a wide oak frame carved by Silas himself, passed down each generation. They said every child in that family was born in that bed, slept in that bed, and eventually died in that bed. No one ever threw it out. No one ever broke it apart for firewood, though winters were cruel and the house had no insulation. The bed stayed. Always. In 1939, a young county nurse named Margaret Ellis was sent to check on the Hargrove family. The report she filed to the state was brief, almost clinical, but one line stands out. Multiple family members of varying ages occupying same bed nightly, citing tradition. Refuse separation. Claim it brings sickness. A year later, the nurse was found dead. Car accident. Officially. But the road where it happened was dry, and the car was found in a ditch miles from any turn. Her case file was sealed for 75 years. The Hargroves carried on. 6 of them in that one-room home, surrounded by fields of dying cotton and memories that wouldn't stay buried. The oldest son, Thomas, worked the land. The mother, Ruth's daughter, never left the property. And every night, they gathered in that same bed, like a ritual they could not abandon. Neighbors said they heard singing. Soft, low, almost like a lullaby, but never in harmony. Always just one voice at a time. And always the same song. The strange part was what happened when anyone asked about it. They'd look at you blankly, like you'd ask them about the weather. That was the thing about the Hargroves, they didn't act guilty. They didn't act afraid. It was as if they genuinely believed that what they were doing, whatever it was the only way their family could survive. There's an old superstition that runs deep in the South, that if a family is cursed, you can't separate the bodies until the curse itself is broken. If one leaves the bed, they say, the others begin to die. Maybe that's just folklore. Maybe it was something darker. Because when that photograph was found, the one with all 6 of them standing in front of the bed, every single person in it had the same eyes. Same distance between them. Same heavy brows. Same bloodline. And according to county records, not one of them ever married outside the family. Not once. They didn't have to. They already had each other. There's a journal, too, discovered in the rafters of that same farmhouse in 1981. Most of the ink had bled with moisture, but a few lines were still legible. It's believed to have been written by Thomas, the eldest son. It reads: Ma says the bed keeps us safe. She says if we leave it, the field will swallow us. She says it remembers the first blood. The first blood. No one knows exactly what that meant. But when the land around the Hargrove house was dug for development, workers uncovered a small pit beneath the foundation, lined with rotted boards and bones too small to belong to livestock. There was no record of any investigation. No arrests. Just silence. That silence, that terrible, deliberate silence, is what carried the Hargrove name all the way into the 1940s. A name spoken in whispers at the diner. A name that children were warned not to say after dark. And yet, for decades, that bed stood. Through rain, rot, and ruin. Generations passed over it like an altar. By the time anyone thought to remove it, the frame had fused to the floor. Nails rusted, boards warped, as if the house itself refused to let it go. Some say the bed is still out there. Hidden in a barn. Bought by a collector who didn't know what he was buying. Others say it was burned in the 1980s when the land was cleared for a new road. But the truth is, no one really knows what happened to it. What we do know, what's been buried under decades of dust and secrecy, is that the Hargrove family wasn't unique. Across the rural South, in the years between the Great Depression and the war, isolation did strange things to people. It broke time. It bent families back into themselves. And sometimes, what grew out of that isolation looked less like kinship and more like entrapment. The Hargroves just left proof. A photograph. A bed. And a story no one wanted to tell. But there's more to it. Because behind that family, behind that bed, lies something much older than 1940. Something that began with a promise. A promise carved into the wood itself. And that's where the story turns from family history, into something else. Something you can still feel, if you listen closely enough. Something that never really left Alabama. When you look closely at the photograph, the one found in the farmhouse drawer, you can see it. Not right away. But once you notice it, you can't unsee it. On the headboard of the bed, just above the youngest child's shoulder, there's a carving. Faint, shallow, but deliberate. 3 letters, SRH. At first, it seems obvious, the initials of the family patriarch, Silas R. Hargrove. But then you remember something, Silas couldn't write. His name in every record was signed with an X. So who carved those letters? And when? Local legend says Silas made the bed himself after the death of his wife, using lumber from the pine trees that grew over her burial ground. He cut the boards by hand, polished them smooth, and whispered her name with every strike of the saw. They say it took him 7 days, and that on the 8th, he locked himself in the house and didn't come out for 3. After that, no one saw him sleep anywhere else. The stories go that Silas told his daughter Ruth the bed was a keeper of the line. That as long as the family stayed close to it, as long as they slept together, no spirit, no sickness, no poverty could take them. But that wasn't protection. It was imprisonment dressed up as love. In the 1920s, a county surveyor named Frank Dillard stayed one night at the Hargrove home during a flood. He later told colleagues that he woke in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. He thought it was wind at first, until he realized it was coming from under the bed. When he lit his lamp, everyone else in the room was awake, staring at him. Silent. Unblinking. He left before dawn and never went back. In his field notebook, the next day's entry reads simply, "Not natural." By the time 1940 came, the Hargroves were nearly forgotten, a shadow family surviving on a shrinking plot of land. What little they grew was barely enough to feed themselves. And yet they refused charity. Refused visits. The few who tried to help said it was like they didn't see the world outside their walls. That year, a traveling photographer named Edward Kent came through Coleman County for a state project documenting rural poverty. When he reached the Hargrove property, he found the family in the field, barefoot and silent, the old bed frame dragged out into the sun. They said they were airing it out, but Edward wrote later that it looked more like a ceremony. He took the photo. The one that ended up in that drawer. But that night, something happened. In his diary, recovered from his estate decades later, there's an entry dated April 14, 1940. They asked me to sleep inside. Said it was safer. Said the bed doesn't like being left alone. He left the next morning before anyone woke up. His last line reads, "The bed is breathing." Historians tend to dismiss those stories, call them exaggerations born from fear, isolation, or superstition. But there's one detail that still unsettles people who've studied the case: the photograph was the last one Edward ever took in Alabama. His next known work was from Tennessee, a month later. His assistant said Edward had refused to discuss that family again, and that he started sleeping with the lights on for the rest of his life. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done, if this was your bloodline? If every night you were told that leaving the bed meant death? Because here's the truth, most of us like to think we'd run. We'd leave. We'd break the cycle. But the Hargroves didn't believe they were trapped. They believed they were chosen. One of Ruth's granddaughters, a woman named Lila, gave a single interview in 1962, long after the family home had been torn down. The tape is faint, warped with age, but her words are clear. Mama said the bed knew who belonged. It would know if someone came who didn't carry the name. And it wouldn't let them rest. When the interviewer asked her what that meant, Lila went quiet. Then she said something that still chills historians today. She said the bed gets hungry. Think about that for a moment. A family bound not by love, not even by fear, but by an inheritance they couldn't refuse. Hunger has a way of changing people. When you grow up in scarcity, when the world outside your walls offers nothing but judgment, hunger becomes the only constant you can trust. It feeds on itself. It becomes ritual. And that's what the Hargrove bed was, a ritual made solid. Some anthropologists believe the bed wasn't just a piece of furniture, but an altar for ancestral offerings, a leftover from older, syncretic beliefs blending early Christianity with pre-colonial folk magic. That kind of faith doesn't die easily. It adapts. It hides in everyday things. A table. A cradle. A bed. In some traditions, a bed shared by blood family was seen as a circle of protection, a ward against evil spirits. But when that belief decays, it can curdle into something unrecognizable. Generations later, the meaning gets lost. The act remains. No one remembers why they do it, only that to stop is dangerous. That's how a custom becomes a curse. By the 1950 census, there were no Hargroves left in Coleman County. The land had changed hands twice, and the farmhouse was already falling apart. But a man named Charles McMullen, who purchased the property in 1953, gave a statement to the local paper. "We tore up the floor in the old bedroom. Underneath, there was another bed frame. Same shape. Smaller. Buried right under the first." He said they burned both frames that night. But his wife, who spoke decades later, told a different story. She said Charles had a breakdown that winter. Started sleepwalking. Started digging in the yard after dark. Whispering names that weren't theirs. When she asked him why, he told her, "I keep hearing them ask for room." There's a theory, whispered among folklorists, that the Hargrove bed wasn't cursed in the traditional sense. That it was simply an anchor. A thing so heavy with memory and suffering that it refused to let go. And maybe, in its own way, it was just doing what it was made to do, keep the family together. But sometimes, together is the worst place to be. Because if the stories are true, then the bed didn't just keep the Hargroves close. It consumed them. One by one. The youngest boy, Samuel, reportedly stopped speaking at age 9. His teacher said he would fall asleep in class, muttering words she couldn't understand. The same words carved into the headboard, SRH. When asked what they meant, Samuel told her, "It says we can't leave yet." 3 months later, he vanished. His family told the sheriff he went to live with cousins in Georgia. But there were no cousins. There never had been. And when officers visited the Hargrove property, the family was calm. Almost peaceful. They said Samuel had simply gone back to the bed. That was the last anyone ever saw of them alive. The next spring, the house was empty. Dishes still on the table. The bed stripped bare, its boards damp and cracked, as if soaked from the inside out. Neighbors said the walls smelled like wet iron. Blood, they thought. But there was no sign of a struggle. No sign of a body. Only silence. And that photograph. Waiting. Like it wanted to be found. Years later, when the land was finally sold off and paved over for the new highway, the construction crew struck something under the soil. They thought it was an old water pipe. But when they dug it up, they found it wasn't metal at all. It was wood, blackened, warped, still whole despite the decades underground. When they broke through the surface, a smell came out that stopped every man in his tracks. Not rot. Not gas. Something else. Something like a body that had never been alive. The foreman, a man named Dennis Ford, told reporters that night, it looked like a bed frame. It was shaped like one. But the wood was wrong, too soft, like it had been breathing under there. Within a week, the entire crew quit. The county sealed the site and rerouted the highway. There was never another word about it in the papers. The property became one of those places locals say is off-limits after dark. But it didn't end there. In 1989, a collector in Birmingham claimed to have acquired what he called the Hargrove bed. He displayed it in a private collection of Southern curiosities, alongside dolls, death masks, and Civil War relics. Visitors described the same thing, a sense that the room got colder the longer you stood near it. The smell of wet dirt. A sound like breathing when no one was moving. 3 months later, that collector was found dead in his home. Heart failure, they said. But his body was discovered not in his bed, in the old Hargrove frame. No one ever found out how it got there. After that, the bed disappeared again. Some believe it was burned. Others say it was purchased by a private buyer and locked in storage, somewhere outside Montgomery. But there's a story, one that never made the papers. A museum curator claimed to have been offered the Hargrove bed in 2002. She said the seller delivered only one warning. If you take it, you have to promise to keep it together. Don't move the boards apart. Don't separate them. When she asked why, the seller said, because it remembers every time someone does. She refused the offer. The bed was never seen again. But every so often, another photograph surfaces. Always anonymous. Always the same composition, a family standing in front of a bed. Faces blank. Eyes hollow. A time stamp from decades apart, but somehow the same eyes looking back. Maybe it's imitation. Maybe it's legend feeding itself. Or maybe it's what happens when something wants to be remembered. Because memory isn't always mercy. Sometimes, its punishment. You can almost imagine what it must have been like, that first night in the Hargrove home. The air thick with dust, the fields whispering outside. The mother telling her children to come close, to stay in the bed, to keep warm. A gesture of love. Protection. And maybe that's how it always begins. Not with horror, but with care twisted by desperation. Generations sleep in the same bed because it's safer that way. Because the world outside is cruel. Because no one else will come for them. Until safety becomes ritual. And ritual becomes law. And law becomes something that eats you alive. That's what the Hargrove bed really was, not a piece of furniture, not a curse, but a monument to what happens when fear becomes inheritance. When love becomes a cage. And maybe that's the part that disturbs us most. Because the Hargroves weren't monsters. They were human. They wanted to belong. They wanted to stay together. And in their own way, they did. If you drive through Coleman County today, there's nothing left of the house. Just a stretch of trees that never seem to grow straight. Locals say that on certain nights, when the fog sits low, you can see an outline in the grass, the shape of a room that isn't there anymore. And if you stop the car, roll down your window, and listen closely, you might hear it. The faint creak of wood. The hush of something shifting under the earth. Breathing. Waiting. Some say it's just the wind through the pines. Others say it's the bed. Still together. Still remembering. Still hungry. And maybe that's the lesson, the one history keeps trying to whisper through places like this. That the past doesn't die just because we stop speaking its name. It waits. Patiently. In photographs, in silence, in the spaces we build our homes upon. In every family that keeps its secrets too tightly. In every room where the air feels heavier than it should. In every dream where you wake and can't remember if you were alone. They say the Hargrove family was buried together, though no one can find their graves. Some think they were cremated. Some think they were never buried at all. And some, the ones who still whisper about the bed, think they never left it. They just went deeper. Down where no one can separate them. Down where names don't matter anymore. Down where the wood is still warm. So if you ever come across an old bed, one too big for its room, carved with initials you don't recognize, do yourself a favor. Don't lie down. Don't touch the wood. And for God's sake, don't fall asleep. Because some things don't rest. They wait. And they always remember who they belong to.